just got whipped cream up my nose. That feels weird.
Hey everyone, in today's video, I want to share 3 things to know about using decodable texts in a K-2 classroom. Now, over the last few years, many of us have recognized the importance of decodable texts in a K-2 classroom and just how valuable they really are. As someone who was previously balanced literacy trained, I definitely had small group guided reading with leveled texts, and my decodables or phonics-based texts were definitely just sprinkled in there, and they were not a main focus of my phonics block. Now that so many of us have really shifted our mindset and understand the importance of decodable text, I want to share 3 things to keep in mind when using these decodable texts. And I also want to point out this book right here. This book is by Wiley Blevins. It's called Choosing and Using Decodable Texts. If you're looking for a place to get started, this book is very well written. It's easy to understand. It's broken up into manageable chapters to read with lots of examples of what high quality decodable texts are, as well as some things to look out for in terms of low quality decodable texts. And it also gives examples of what you should do with your decodable texts in the classroom to get the most use out of them. I'm sure there are other books as well, but like I said, if you're looking to just get started, this book is a great one to kick off your learning with. It just came out in 2021, and I love Wiley Blevins. If you're ready to hear these 3 tips about decodable readers, give this video a like, subscribe to my channel, and let's dive in. Alright, tip number 1 is a big one, and I wanted to kick off by saying that decodable texts do not need to be 100% decodable. Now, as there's been such a huge shift from balanced literacy to structured literacy, people have been searching and searching for these decodable texts, and people have recognized the importance of decodable texts, which is good. But sometimes when things happen really quickly, things start to fall through the cracks. And one of those things is sometimes teachers are looking for an arbitrary number that these decodable texts need to be. And some teachers even believe that decodable texts need to be 100% decodable. Now, in this book that I referenced earlier, Wiley Blevins states that there is actually no research showing that a text needs to be 100% decodable. I've also read many other journals and studies in the past. I know Tim Shanahan had written an article years ago about this decodable text phenomenon and how quickly it's growing, and how some states are, choosing an arbitrary number, like, your text must be 90% decodable, and if they're not, you cannot use them in a classroom. And now, while I understand that perspective, what that can do is that can often create a lot of low quality decodable texts. Now, in the Shanahan article that I mentioned, and I will link it down below for reference, he does say that most experts kind of agree upon about 80% decodability, that if a text is 80% decodable, with some other high frequency words and story words sprinkled in there to have the story make sense, then it is oftentimes a better decodable text than something that is 100% decodable and doesn't make sense. Since there's been this kind of race to get the best decodable text out there, sometimes to make them 100% decodable or even 95% decodable, authors have had to do things like make up silly names, or they've had to really lose the plot of a story to add in some nonsensical words that might be real words, but students never really hear. And if that's the case, then students aren't really going to understand what they're reading, especially in such a short text. If all these uncommon words are kind of thrown in there, they might not get the gist of the story. And even though we do recognize that we want our students to be able to decode words, and that might be priority number 1 when using a decodable text, we also need to understand that the end goal is for them to comprehend it, right? We are teaching decoding as a means to get to comprehension, and we don't want to lose that. So when you're looking for your own decodable text, you do want to make sure that they are high quality, and that doesn't necessarily mean that all, 100% decodable texts are bad. I don't know if I've personally seen any that I've been like, oh, that's a great story, because again, it's okay to pre-teach some high frequency words if your students haven't learned them yet, or some story words, right? Not a bunch. Think about it. If 80% of a short passage is decodable, then most of it's decodable. And if you have to teach your students how to read the word elephant, and you're gonna circle it and show them, hey, this is a story word that's in here. I don't expect you to know how to sound it out, but when we get to it and it's circled, let's just remember that that says elephant. And if you're doing it in a small group and your students are trying to sound it out, you just simply tell them elephant. and then move on to decoding the rest of the story. So when choosing a decodable for your students, you want to make sure, number one, that it makes sense. You want to make sure that it has some sort of engaging plot and that the story goes along in a functional and engaging way. And you also want to make sure that the story doesn't confuse students later on. For example, if it's a nonfiction text where it's supposed to actually teach students something, but you're trying to make it decodable, if you use language that is too vague, it's going to confuse students later on. And there's really no need to do that. This was an example Wiley Blevins gave in that book that I referenced earlier from a nonfiction decodable that was using too simple language. It said, "The sun will make plants rise." And each page in that story was very simplistic, and it had some elements of being correct, but also in the future it's just going to confuse students in terms of how the sun actually interacts with the plant to help the plant grow. And rise obviously was used in there instead of grow, probably, because they wanted to make it decodable. And again, you really want to make sure that the text you're choosing and the words you're choosing are only going to further students' learning, not kind of hinder them. If you're wondering some of my favorite decodable books for K-2 learners, first, I absolutely love these right here. These are the Flyleaf readers. I also love these ones right here, which are the Half Pint readers. And lastly, I like these right here, which are the Just Right readers. I will link all three of those down below in case you want to check them out. They are very expensive usually because they are from a publisher, so usually a district would go ahead and buy those. So if your district is looking for some high quality decodables, those would be three I would suggest to check out to see if they meet the needs of your K-2 students. Now, if you don't have a set of decodable readers for your own classroom, you can go ahead and make some decodable sentences for your students to read that you could simply type out and print out for them. Kind of similar to my one-page interventions right here, where up at the top I have students reviewing sounds that they've already learned, then they practice reading words in isolation, and then they go ahead and decode those decodable sentences. There's also, of course, a spot on there for students to practice encoding, and then they also have to draw a picture of a sentence to make sure that they understand what it means. Now, when choosing those sentences, not only did I want to make sure that they were decodable, but I also wanted to make sure that they made sense, so they could actually visualize an image when they were doing it. Now, with sentences, it is a lot easier to get a higher percentage of decodable words in there because you're only doing one sentence at a time. When you are going on to passages or poems or longer stories, it gets a little bit more difficult, which is usually why it's okay for that decodable percentage to kind of lower. If you're looking for longer options, I do have these decodable mini books that I love. These are all at least 80% decodable, and they do work through that same process where students are decoding words in isolation. They are mapping out words, doing some phoneme grapheme mapping, and then they have to read and reread a passage. And then there's even a spot on the back for them to draw a picture of what happened to make sure they understand the story. That unit I created for a ton of different skills, and for each phonics skill introduced, I actually have 2 different stories for students to look at. So I love that unit there. And then I also have my decodable phonics poems. Now, I've mentioned this in the past, but I created these poems originally in 2014, and they were not decodable, is how I would word it. They were not at all. They were just kind of a fun story that had some focus words that students had to circle and decode just that word, but they might not be able to read the rest of the poem. So over the last year, I've actually gone through and added a completely decodable, and when I say completely, I don't mean 100%, but at least 80%, and most of them are closer to 90, honestly, version of each poem in there. So I will link all of those resources down in the description below. All right, tip number 2 to keep in mind when using decodable text in the classroom is that decodables don't need to be done independently. Now, many times because we are finding these high percentage decodables, we are able to teach a concept aloud to the whole class, and then we can give them these decodables to do independently. But we can actually extend this learning by using decodables in our small groups. Now, in a similar fashion to when we would do guided reading groups, we can do a lot of the same types of skills with decodables. And what I mean by this is if we find good quality, high quality decodable texts that really have a storyline and allow our students to kind of dive a little deeper into the story, then there's more we can do with that story instead of just having students decode each word. If we use our decodables in small groups, we can call students back to our table, we can introduce the phonics skill that will be worked on in the story, we can review it before we go in and read, we can have our students actually highlight and find those words in the passage, we can front load any vocabulary or high frequency words that are going to come up in the story, or any of those story words that I mentioned that might be in there. This is a great time to kind of do all that before we dive in and read our story. Once we've done all that, that's when we can have students actually read the text. They can go ahead and start decoding. And I would do it in the same way I used to do my guided reading groups, where I would have them kind of whisper read it, and I can check in with each student to see how they're doing, and we can ask questions along the way. We can check in for their comprehension. Again, we don't always want these decodables to be kind of passed along to our students, for them to take it, read it by themselves, and then file it away in their book folder or their book bin, not to be talked about again. Because yes, while we want our students to decode these words, we want them to do more than just that. We want to make sure that they're comprehending what they're reading. All right, and tip number 3 when using decodable readers is to extend students' learning by connecting it to writing. So if you followed steps 1 and steps 2 and you picked a high quality decodable text, and then you brought your students back and you actually went through it with them and asked them comprehension questions, then after you've done that, you can send your students off to write about the text to further their learning. This is a great way for students to really process what they've read and extend their learning a little bit further and to keep them in that story. Some things you can have students write about include write a quick retelling of the story. And again, this does not need to be some sort of long passage. This is a K-2 classroom we're talking about. So in 2nd grade, they might write a full retelling. In 1st grade, they might have 3 boxes that say beginning, middle, and end, and maybe they write a sentence for each. And in kindergarten, maybe they're drawing a picture in each of those boxes, sharing what happened at the beginning, middle, and end of the story. You could also have students simply draw a picture of what happened in the story and use labels. This way, instead of writing, they are drawing and labeling an important thing that happened in the story. Students could continue the story, and you could say, okay, if you were the author here, what would you have happen next? If it's an informational story, you can have students write down 3 things they learned. And again, you can also have students do that with pictures and labeling. And then you can have students make their own story. For example, if they read the decodable story, Tim's Trip, maybe they can go ahead and write in their journal or write on a piece of paper about a trip they've experienced or a trip that they would want to take. Those type of writing extensions are great ways for students to continue that learning after they've already done an explicit phonics lesson with you, they have read the decodable text with you and answered some comprehension questions, then they can go off on their own and continue that learning while you pull another group back. So while there are many different benefits of using decodable readers and things to keep in mind, in this video I just wanted to share 3 things to know or remember about using those decodable readers. To recap, number 1 is that a decodable reader does not need to be 100% decodable. Number 2 is that decodable texts don't need to be used independently. And number 3 is we can connect writing to our decodable texts. If you have any other questions about decodable texts or any other top tips for using them that you found helpful in your K-2 classroom, let us know down in the comments. As always, everything I mentioned in this video will be linked in the description, and I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, please give it a thumbs up so I know. Make sure you are subscribed to my channel and click that bell. That way you're notified of every new video. See you in the next one. Bye.